Welcome to Lecture for Research Methods. Talking about APA styles. I'm today about the first half of Chapter 4 of the manual, looking at the mechanics of style, really the nuts and bolts, spelling, grammar, punctuation type things. And there are lots of very specific rules in this chapter about mechanics. And I'm not going to cover everything because I'm confident in your ability to read and understand what's said there. So what I'll do here is address those rules or situations that in my experience students have most commonly struggled with, and those things where the manual may be a bit vague. So starting off talking about punctuation in terms of spacing, spacing after punctuation marks. There's almost always a single space after a punctuation mark, comma, a semicolon, colon. And if you're like me, you were probably taught to put two spaces after a colon, but not in APA style, it's just one space. That's one kind of weird thing. So typical things like blah blah blah, the end of the story, semicolon, one space in the next clause, however, the first, blah blah blah. But you don't put spaces after internal periods and abbreviations. So one example here, the blah blah blah, the largest military installation in the free world, i.e. Fort Hood. So there's no period after the I in i.e. because that's an internal period. It's internal to the abbreviation. If we didn't need a comma after the period following the E, there could be a space there because that period is not internal. And in terms of periods at the end of sentences, in this version of the manual, APA recommends putting two spaces after the punctuation at the end of a sentence, whether that's a period, question mark, exclamation point, because it makes it easier on readers to read. The last manual said one space, and they did that mostly, I think, to try to save paper and ink. And the manual before that, I think, said two spaces. So really, with this rule, I'm okay with either approach, whatever you've gotten kind of comfortable with, because it's hard to change whatever you're comfortable with now from one space or two spaces after a period. Just be sure you're consistent, whichever one you do it the same way throughout your entire paper, and I think that's fine. In terms of spacing between lines, double spacing throughout the paper. Almost everything in the paper, including the reference section, should be double spaced. And just set your document to format to double space. Don't go through in space after each line. Don't hit return at the end of the line like you would on a typewriter, because then when you edit, it's going to screw things up. So just let the word processor, word processing software, wrap the text and set it to the default of double spacing. In terms of periods, we already talked a little bit about periods, but obviously use them at the end of a declarative sentence. You also use them with abbreviations, things like e.g., i.e., but we don't use them with certain abbreviations. So abbreviations of states, acronyms like APA, if that's short for American Psychological Association or American Psychiatric Association, whichever one. Most measurement abbreviations, so centimeter, foot, no period there. With the exception of, I have inch here, we have the IN period, and that's the only measurement abbreviation that has a period, and it has it because it could potentially be confused with the word in, so it gets a period, but the rest of the abbreviations for measurements don't. Okay, a little bit more now about punctuation, looking at commas. Obviously use them to separate elements of a series, because you might, the red, blue, and yellow, whatever. And the thing that some of these people do here, I think it's taught in other classes maybe, is they don't put a comma after, say, the word blue before the and. I think the and takes the place of the comma. For APA style, you still need a comma there as well. So make sure you put a comma separating each element of a series. We talked before about restrictive and non-restrictive clauses, right? Which clauses and that clauses or phrases. So you don't use commas with that phrases, those restrictive clauses. But we do use them for which clauses. So an example of when you would use it with the instructions, which indicated the appropriate volume, were displayed blah blah. If it had been the instructions that indicated the appropriate volume, it would indicate only some of the instructions indicated this thing, and it would be a different phrase, and you wouldn't set off the that phrase with commas. But if there's a which phrase, then it is separated by commas. Obviously, also use commas with conjunctions, and, but, or, because. So, blah blah to the end, comma, but she said, blah blah blah. And just so make sure you put the comma in there before the conjunction, and make sure that if you do have phrase, comma, conjunction, phrase, that each of those phrases are independent clauses. Right? Here's an example of one that wouldn't be. The dog ate all of the food, comma, and drank all of the water. And it's the easiest way for me to always make sure that I've got independent clauses is to cover one side and look at the other. So the dog ate all of the food. Okay, that's a complete sentence. That's fine. Now look at the second part. Drank all of the water. No, drank all of the water clearly isn't a complete sentence. It's missing some stuff. So this isn't punctuated appropriately. So I could just remove the comma, or if I wanted to maintain that structure, it would be dog ate all of the food and it drank all of the water. So I need a subject in that second clause for it to be an independent clause. Okay. Looking at semicolons now. When you're separating independent clauses, two independent clauses, and you could potentially do it with three or more, but it starts to get unwieldy. So typically two independent clauses. So instead of using maybe a conjunction, you should have two independent clauses that are related. So you're going to, instead of putting a period in between them with two short clauses, separate them with a semicolon. That's fine, but it's the same rule we talked about with the conjunction. Each clause needs to be fully independent. We talked before about if you have a series with at least one element that has commas, and you separate the elements using semicolons. So nothing new there. In terms of colons, it's typically used between an introductory clause and a final phrase that illustrates, extends, or amplifies that preceding thought. And the important thing here is to be able to use a colon, that introductory clause, the thing that comes before the colon, must be grammatically complete. Right? You should be able to stop at the colon and have a complete sentence in the first part. So here's an example of something that would be appropriate. The theory suggests that at least three distinct outcomes are possible. Colon, one space. Men will become more aggressive. Men will become more passive, or men will become emotionally dysregulated. So the thing before the colon has to be a complete sentence. It is, and that's fine. The thing after the colon doesn't have to be a complete sentence. It can be a phrase. It typically is just a phrase that modifies or extends, elaborates on the first thing. So an example where it wouldn't be right is if I said three possible outcomes suggested by the research are, and then I have the same thing. So here, if I stop, three possible outcomes suggested by the research are, that's not a complete sentence. I'm missing something. So if I'd written it that way, then I would just, that's fine, just take out the colon. You don't need the colon if you're going to put that helping verb there. Right? Okay. In terms of using a dash, you can use two of them like commas to set off a non-essential clause, which if you have lots of commas elsewhere, sometimes that can be helpful. But you want to be sure not overuse dashes, just because people aren't really used to it, so maybe uncomfortable for some readers. But an example of when it might work, the stimuli chosen, one designed to elicit fear and one designed to elicit sadness, were presented blah 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 blah. So I've got this non-essential clause. That clause isn't essential to the rest of the sentence, just kind of elaborates on an earlier part. Instead of setting it off by commas, I could set it off with these dashes. And to get a dash, you hit the hyphen twice on your word processor, and it should make it into a long single dash. For quotation marks, which we've talked about elsewhere, talk a little bit more now. Use double quotes for slang, invented expressions, to convey irony. But you only use the quotes the first time that a word or phrase is presented. So use the first time to kind of say, okay, here, pay attention to this. This is slang, or this is some new phrase, or I'm being ironic, and that should say irony, not iron. Sorry, typo there. But after that, you can omit the quotation marks. So an example of where you might use with irony, if you're talking about kids that use aggression to get what they want, and sometimes they're successful getting what they want. So you might say, the successes of children who use aggression to get what they want, and you put successes in double quotes, and so you're indicating that you recognize that it's not a good thing to be successful at being aggression. So with slang, use it. But this is kind of a weird thing. If the word or phrase is a technical term, not slang, then you use italics rather than quotes. So if we're saying some sentence like the designation of some children is having a disorganized, defiant attitude, and you had disorganized, defiant is obviously hyphenated modifying attitude. Disorganized, defiant may be a new kind of phrase, but it's not slang, so it's italicized, not put in quotes. So not technical terms, use italics for that. If there's a title of an article that you're talking about in text, which you don't typically do, right? We typically just have the author's name and the year, but sometimes there's a particular article that's just really important, and you may want to say, in the seminal article published by Smith, titled blah blah blah. If you want to do that, it's okay, and you put the title in quotes. If it's from a journal, but not titles of books, magazines, or movies. For those, we use italics instead. Obviously, if you're quoting something of less than 40 words, it goes in double quotes. In terms of, when to use single quotes, that's when you have a quote where the author is quoting something. So in the material you're reading, they have some words and then double quotes, some more words in double quotes. So, and then you want to quote that whole thing. You don't want to have double quotes inside of double quotes. So you turn what they had as double quotes into single quotes, and then put your double quotes outside the rest of the quotation that you're taking. One other thing about quotation marks, as I think we've talked about before, the in punctuation at the end of the quote doesn't go inside the quotation marks, right? You have whatever the quoted sentence is, no period yet, in quotes, parentheses, page, whatever page number it's on, close parentheses, and then the end punctuation, and then the period after that. Looking at a few more things on punctuation. I know it seems like a lot. In terms of parentheses, mostly you use it with citations, right? And your parenthetical notation when you're citing articles or other sources, use parentheses. We've talked about how to do that. But sometimes you'll have more than one thing inside the parentheses. Maybe it's more than one citation. So Smith and Jones, 1990, and Barnes and Herrera, 1973. You don't put "and" between the two things. You separate them with a semicolon. But also other stuff. If you get to the end of a sentence, and you would typically have, parentheses, something, maybe an abbreviation, or whatever, and then you would follow that. You would think, oh, follow that right with another set of parentheses with the citation. You don't have back-to-back parentheses where the parentheses would touch. You just merge them and put a semicolon there. So, if I have some sense of saying, in the study published by the National Institute of Mental Health, and so typically I would then put that abbreviation inside parentheses, following the fully spelling out the phrase, and then you think, okay, and I've got to cite it, which was in some article by Johnson. And I have another set of parentheses. So instead of having two sets of parentheses, again, I kind of merge them, and where the two parentheses would touch, you put a semicolon. So it's NIMH, semicolon, single space, Johnson, 1991. Another thing that's a little different, when you have kind of nested parentheses, it's at least for me, the opposite of the way I was taught. I was always taught, at least kind of thinking in math classes, where you have brackets on the outside and then parentheses internal to brackets. APA, it's the opposite. If you would have nested parentheses, the inner parentheses become brackets. So I'll give you an example here. E.g., the personality assessment inventory, and I'm going to abbreviate it. And it needs to be in parentheses, but the whole phrase is already within parentheses, so that those become brackets instead. So it's a little different than maybe what you learned. In terms of using a slash, don't use a slash instead of the word or. So, male or female participants, don't put male/female. Because male-female participants might be taken differently, might be misconstrued. Are you talking about participants that aren't clearly male or female, or what are you saying? So it can lead to ambiguity. So there really aren't many uses in APA style for a slash. There are some, but don't use it instead of or. Okay? In terms of Microsoft Word or whatever word processing software you're using, pay attention to the squiggly lines that they use, right, whenever they show grammatical or spelling errors. These are frequently in line with APA style. And I say frequently because not always. Sometimes when you're trying to conform to APA style, Word will say you're wrong. Sometimes. But as a rule, Word's pretty good about being consistent with what APA style is looking for. So at least whenever you get a little green squiggly line, look at it and try to figure out, okay, is there something wrong here with my sentence construction or my punctuation or my grammar? Okay, getting away from punctuation now to look at spelling, the preferred spelling. You can check Webster's Collegiate Dictionary 2005. It's kind of the reference that APA gives. Say, okay, we're all going to agree on one source to say, okay, this is how things are spelled. Let's use this one, which it's not like they spell things in a weird way, but it's one agreed upon source. It's good to use spell check, like I just said. But know that spell check is not sufficient. It's a good start, but it's not sufficient. You can't trust it. It will leave you high and dry sometimes. So a phrase like, you can see 4 miles, well, if you had intended to say you can see a long way, FOR 4 miles, spell check would say, oh yeah, you're fine, that looks good, and it's actually grammatically correct too, but it's not what you intended to say. So spell check isn't going to catch that. You've got to catch that yourself. So again, spell check is a good start, but don't use it kind of as an automatic, oh, if it says everything's spelled right, then I clearly have spelled everything correctly. Okay. Another thing to kind of look out for, and we've talked about this already, I think, the plural of Latin and Greek words. So you said data, is plural, datum is the singular, appendix is singular, appendices is plural. Those are the most common ones people struggle with. And then kind of a weird thing, possessive plurals ending in S. So things like talking about the energy level of more than one participant, the participant's energy level. Obviously you have participants, it's plural word, so then it has an apostrophe, not an apostrophe S. And most people have no problem with that. It's pretty straightforward. The problem is, well, let's explain that. Talking about maybe Anna and Sigmund Freud. Talking about the two of them, their tendency to meet regularly. So I have the Freud's tendency to meet regularly. So here, Freud's has been made plural with the S. So it's just like participants above, just have an apostrophe after the S. And if it had just been one of them, say Anna Freud, it would be, Anna's preferred, so Freud's preferred, whatever, just an apostrophe S. Where it gets tricky for some people is whenever you have words that end in S that aren't plural. So maybe if there's some researcher named Mathis, and Mathis has a theory, it's Mathis's theory, and you have S apostrophe S because the Mathis isn't plural. If there was more than one Mathis, we would have the Mathises, and then that plural would be Mathises apostrophe no S. So just pay attention to your apostrophes and your S's, and if the word is plural or singular. Okay. Hyphenation, which is the last thing we'll talk about for today. When you're not sure if two words should be hyphenated as one word, or if maybe a word, something you think is one word is really one word, or is it two words, or is it sort of hyphenated compound? The best thing to do is start at the dictionary and see how they list it, and then beyond that, APA has some kind of general principles to help guide you. When looking at compound modifiers, and compound modifiers are whenever you have two or more words together that serve to modify some other part of the sentence. So they may serve as an adjective, may serve as an adverb. It'll be more clear when we start looking at what they are. But when we guiding our decision of whether or not to hyphenate is, well, would hyphenating help keep people from misreading what I'm saying, or to make it more clear, or to make it less clear. And you want to do whatever makes it more clear and decrease the likelihood of somebody misreading what you're trying to see. Okay. So there's some things that are temporary compounds. So there's some things that are permanent compounds, like high school, right? And that's all one word, and you can look that up in the dictionary. But if something's not in the dictionary, then it's probably a temporary compound. It's where you have two words that are put together that aren't always together, and at least not together enough to be accepted as one word in the dictionary. But you're using them together, like short-term memory, long-term parking. So whether or not you use a hyphen will depend on the placement. Whenever the compound modifier is before the target, you hyphenate. So talking about some sort of oxygen-enriched environment, right? It's not a oxygen environment. It's not an enriched environment that's oxygen, right? It's an oxygen-enriched environment. Those two words work together to modify the other verb. And so you hyphenate to help make it clear. If the modifier comes after the target, you don't need the hyphen. So environments that are oxygen enriched, you no longer need the hyphen because less likely to be confused. When looking at prefixes, we typically don't hyphenate, and you can look in the manual for the kind of list of all the common prefixes. One of the ones you'll see most common will be post and pre. So post-traumatic, that's all one word with no hyphen. Anti-war, one word, no hyphen. An exception would be something like co-occur, when you have these two vowels together. That would make the word look really funny. Cougar. It would be hard to read that. And instances like that, you do hyphenate. And an exception to this rule real quick, I think I should have touched on earlier. So we jump back a second to the temporary compound as a modifier. You don't hyphenate if one of the words is an ly word, if it's an adverb. So like a slowly moving car. Right? So slowly moving modifies car, but since it's an ly word, it's just slowly space moving space car. Right? Or even a comparative superlative. So better prepared soldiers. That doesn't get hyphenated either. And with prefixes, we typically don't hyphenate, with some exceptions, and you can read about the exceptions in the manual. Sometimes you'll have a common base when you have multiple modifiers together that share a base. When that happens, you can leave off the base the first time. So talking about first place finishers and second place finishers, you should do first hyphen space and second hyphen place finishers. So long and short-term memory, you don't have to say long-term and short-term memory. So APA allows you that, makes it flow a little better, I think. And then the last thing, any phrase that uses self, whether it's used as a modifier or as a noun. So self-esteem, self-loathing, self-imposed, whatever, almost always you're going to hyphenate those phrases. But again, like anything else, there always are some exceptions, like talking about self-psychology. For some reason that's not hyphenated. But almost everything else with self, go ahead and hyphenate it. So again, remember, there's lots of stuff in this chapter. Familiarize yourself with it. Try to wrap your mind around the general principles behind these things, and then I think you'll find yourself not making very many of these kind of grammatical mistakes. Good luck.